Hey, Aubrey, how are you? It's so
I'm
good to
good. How
see
are
you
you?
here and good to be talking to you about China. Um, Thank you for joining the team and thank you for hosting. You just open up very quickly with just a little bit of background. You know a lot of this, but I just want to remind our listeners. Um, uh, I've had a long career as a China scholar and done a lot of work in different venues, academia, and even worked in the corporate world for a while for Apple in China. Um, and when I left that work and came back to academia and just kind of producing knowledge, we launched this little think tank called On Global Leadership. And at On Global Leadership, we like to think of ourselves as a boots on the ground team. We are a team that doesn't just read statistics or read newspapers or read speeches by Chinese officials. Um, we have a team in China, and I spend as much time in China. I'm based in the United States. I'm a professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, but I also spend as much time in China as I can. And that's been my whole brand and life of being a China scholar is getting out into the field and talking to people and kind of going deep on topics where we are boots on the ground. So I do that with my China team as often as possible. And one of the things that OGL launched a couple of years ago with Christine Ying, who's a friend and partner with OGL for a little while, was to develop a podcast presence. So in addition to the writing that we do on the OGL site, and that's ongloballeadership.com, all one word, ongloballeadership.com. We produce a lot of articles that have to do with deep research and also what we call real time China. We also want to have a podcast presence. And we're rebranding this podcast as On the Ground in China podcast. And so it's sort of a reference to our boots on the ground approach. We believe in statistics and data and all of the important news, but we also believe in ethnographic work where we're out in the field talking to people and hearing what they have to say and learning everything that they do. And so that's sort of the relaunch here. And I'm so thankful that you, Aubrey, are joining us as our new host. So thank you for being here. And what could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. So, my name is Aubrey Martinson, and I'm here to help with the podcast, but also here to help with the organization of On Global Leadership and support the team as you all do your important work of connecting the dots between the US and the Chinese economies.
Nice. Okay. Well, again, welcome. And one of the things that we want our listeners to learn is we want them to learn about what's really going on in China. This is a really, really important moment in the history of the world and in the history of China and the history of US China relations. But again, we get a lot of talking heads who read State Statistical Bureau data or read their own biased approaches, what we think are biased approaches to how we think. And we read all of those statistics and we read all of those speeches, but we also get out and talk to people. And so that's really what our brand is. And that's what we want to do with this dialogue.
I love it because I think there's only so much that statistics can tell you about how life is lived, and I think that, you with your team, you've spent time in China. Your team lives there. So I want to start just with a little tidbit about why you even found yourself in China in the first place. And I think it has to do with your capability with the language. Can you share that story?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking that. When I was growing up, I had a mom who was very ambitious for herself and her young son, and she wanted me to be a politician and maybe Secretary of State and maybe something else. And so I went to the University of Chicago to study economics because I think the University of Chicago is an amazing institution and it's an amazing place to study economics. And so I was going to study economics, go work for a consulting firm, and then develop a career in politics. As fate would have it, I had a Taiwanese roommate and we became dear friends. We actually went to high school together and we went to the University of Chicago together as friends and roommates. And we used to play games with him, um, you know, Chinese tones and teaching me language. And so when we were signing up for our, you know, second year courses, I had to take a language at the University of Chicago. And so why not just try Chinese? I'll try. I have a Taiwanese roommate who says my tones are pretty good, and I'll just try it. And Aubrey, I have to tell you, it was the biggest turning point in my life because I fell in love with the language, and I fell in love with the history as I started to learn it. That was also the year of the Tiananmen movement, and so I was watching kids my age, change their thousands years old nation. And it was just like such a moving thing. And it turned out that I was pretty good at the language and I was in love with the language. And so I took a year of leave of absence between my sophomore and junior year and went to live in Taiwan and just studied Chinese. And when I came back, I still minored in economics, but I became a Chinese language and literature major. And so I just studied China. It was my life. And so when I went to graduate school, instead of just going to, work at a consulting firm like my mom had planned for me, I went to graduate school and studied the economic sociology of China. And the first time I lived in China was in Shanghai in 1994 doing my doctoral dissertation research. And I've been married to China ever since. It's just been my life. And so I, became a China scholar and then, worked at a number of different business schools, was the dean of a business school for a little while, and left academia and then was the head of Apple University in China, where I was helping the company navigate the rough waters of China in the current era. And then came back to the United States because I had to get my family back, but just still have been a China scholar through and through. And that's just my life. I'm married to the country.
Yeah, and I think that's really I think to me it's a really beautiful story and also just a story about the random happenstance of life and how you just got connected with somebody who helped you open a door to really discover something that you're truly passionate about, and you've spent so much time in China, thinking about, how to help American companies do business in China. And I think now there's a lot of opportunity for cross pollination between the two countries and between the businesses and their people. So I think it's a fun story that I think our listeners might enjoy. And like, why the heck are you so passionate about China, Doug? And I think also another something I wanted to bring in is I know you travel to China often, right? We mentioned that, but the boots on the ground who are living in China, maybe talk about the team that we've got in Shanghai.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, Aubrey, and this is a team that are people that have influenced my life for decades. When I left China in 2019, so I was with Apple in China from 2014 to 2019, and it was very, very interesting and important times. And books have been written about that period. Patrick McGee's international bestseller, Apple in China, the capture of the world's greatest company, is about that period and that story. And it was a really, really amazing time, but I had to get my family back. My wife and kids wanted to come back to the United States. And so it was time for us to leave at some point in about 2019. So in the fall of 2019, we came back. And that was when we launched On Global Leadership. But then very quickly after that, COVID hit. And it was terrifying to me, to your question, Aubrey, because again, my brand is a boots on the ground person. My entire academic career has been tied to the early work that I did, where I didn't just use state statistical level data, but I went and visited hundreds and hundreds of factories and interviewed factory directors and managers and just, mixed economic analysis with ethnographic anthropological analysis. And so it was terrifying to me, Aubrey, if I was not going to be able to be in China. Like, what would that mean for my entire brand? And at the time, and not just my brand, but my ways that I think knowledge is most importantly purported to the world. And so when I was panicking over that in early 2020, I picked up the phone and called an old friend, and she was an old mentor of mine, going back to 1994 when I was first doing my doctoral dissertation research in China. Diane Long was the first female president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai ever, and she was just a rock star consultant. And she took me under her wing in 1994 and sort of taught me how to do on the ground research in the field. And she, you know, was semi-retired. She had a very good career. She and her husband and another colleague had launched a company called Xanadu Enterprises, which is a consulting company that helps foreign companies navigate China. And they'd been in that field for a long time and were semi-retired. And I called them and said, why don't we, why don't we launch a project? You guys will be my boots on the ground for On Global Leadership. And so they became On Global Leadership partners. Tragically, Diane passed away about a year and a half ago. Her husband, Dashel Chen, and their partner, Chris Gao, are still deeply involved with the On Global Leadership team. And so they're our boots on the ground. So I get to China about 4 times a year and spend as much time there doing research on the ground as I can. But they are our eyes and ears and boots on the ground every day. And so they're a really important part of the team. So thank you for asking about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just speaks to the importance of that ethnographic research portion of your work. The numbers tell one story, but talking to people and finding out how they're living, how they're working, how are policies impacting them in their daily life, in their work life, I think that's so crucial. And so I really admire the deep dive that you all take with your work. And I guess speaking of deep dives, I think the blog post that we put up on the ongloballeadership.com website really speaks to the depth of the work you all are doing, or I guess we all are doing. And so I think we wanted to talk a little about the work that we did in 2025 in a couple of the highlight articles. We're hearing you talk about the AI talk you gave, and just thinking about AI because you're sort of a self-proclaimed sort of AI curmudgeon, not quite those words, but that's the gist I've got. Because AI is so crucial to the world, the global economy right now, but especially, the competitive nature between China and the US, different specialties. I think the kind of the AI race is really important. And so you may have had to think about AI a little bit more, but it's really, that's something that has really widened your perspective, right? And so let's talk a little bit about that, the kind of the Doug's own personal AI transformation, but also just what you've learned as you've been studying the AI in China versus the AI in the US. Feel free to
Well,
dive into that one wherever you want to start.
yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question, Aubrey. And you know, just thank you for also citing the article that we wrote that was sort of our last article of 2025, looking back on the year, because it was a great year for OGL, and it was a really important year for China and for US-China relations. I mean, we sort of started the year in January of 2025 with the new president Trump and his second presidency and the launch of a new trade war, and things feeling very, very, very tense. And where is this trade war going to go, and what is it going to mean for US-China relations? But what is it going to mean for companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart? Most people don't know this, but Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States. Not a Chinese company, Walmart. And the deep embeddedness of Apple in China. Apple doesn't just work with Foxconn or a few suppliers. Apple works with 1,600 suppliers in China. And Tesla's Gigafactory in Shanghai is its most important factory in the world, probably, where they're relying on suppliers that BYD is coaching. And so it's just, we're so deeply embedded. It was really interesting to me as a China scholar and a China watcher of what is going to happen here. And then over the course of the year, we saw, coming closer of President Trump and President Xi. The meeting in September was a very, very powerful moment because President Trump flew to South Korea and met with Xi Jinping. And it was very, very interestingly honorific that President Trump referred to the meeting as a meeting of the G2, which was essentially saying to President Xi Jinping, like, it's you and me, bud. Like, we're the ones who are running the world. China wants that kind of recognition. It's the second largest economy in the world, but it's not a member of the G7. It's a member of the G20, which is more generally developing nations. And, they want the recognition for what they're doing. And so there's a lot of that kind of work that's sort of the backdrop of what we do. But, to your point, I'm a little bit of a AI Luddite or an AI curmudgeon, or have been, just because, and I come at this as somebody who is a professor and teaches students, and I worry that AI is ruining education because, it's been such a noticeable difference, Aubrey. Like, you know, kids come to class and they won't have done any of the readings. They will have just tapped into ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT the questions that are on the syllabus. And, then they turn their work in as if that's their own work. And, and I have to explain to them that's called plagiarism. And that's not allowed. But I just worry that it's like, making our students a little lazy. Now, I was about 4 years ago asked by my dean to join the AI committee. And I was like, Dean, I think you have the wrong person. I am the biggest AI, anti-AI person, AI Luddite there is. And he's like, Doug, we need various views on this committee. And I want you to be on this committee and co-chair it with your colleague. And I said, I'm not going to co-chair the committee, but I'll be on it. Okay, okay. And over the course of 4 years, Aubrey, I've learned a lot because I've learned that, I'm not being a responsible professor if I'm not teaching our students how to use this tool that is probably the most important tool in multiple industries right now. And so if I'm just putting my head in the sand and pretending it doesn't exist, then I'm being a bad professor. And so I've come around over the years on that. And then about 2 months ago, the chair of the AI committee, my colleague Angelina, said, Doug, I want you to give a talk on AI in China. And I was like, Angelina, I'm not an AI expert. Ask someone. And she's like, Doug, put your big boy pants on, bud. You are a China expert and we need you to be talking about this. So I got together with my OGL team and we thought about what the approach would be. And yes, we can bring the China knowledge, but what are we bringing to how we think about this? And here's the really interesting thing that came out of this, Aubrey. I mean, it was a fascinating talk for me because, again, I don't feel like an AI expert, but I can analyze what China's doing and compare it to what the United States is doing. And it's a really interesting dynamic right now. And I think it's one that we all need to step up and think about in the world. The general view of AI is that the United States is leading the world in AI, right? We're building the best interface. We have the most private investment. We have the most aggressive development across industries, particularly in Silicon Valley, but flowing into many different white collar information based industries like the legal field, the accounting field, the consulting field. It's a big play. But the really interesting thing to me is that the story, and you can even find this if you go into ChatGPT and ask it to compare the United States and China, it will tell you that the United States is much better in user interface. It's much better in creating personal interactive dialogue between the ChatGPT and the user or whatever framework you're using. China's not. China's DeepSeek is very good at math models and very good at logic, but it's not a good user interface. And we know that the Chinese government is also controlling DeepSeek. So, it's questionable about what you're actually going to get from it. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. So, okay, so the story is that the United States is better. But when I got deep into this topic and my team and I did the research on it, the word better is not the right word. Different, for sure. The focus in the United States is on user interface and a very sociable and interactive dialogue. And you have, a voice that's talking to you sometimes, and you can get lots of things out of it that make it feel very personally attuned to what you want, right? China's not focused on that. China is focused on the ways in which you use AI to improve smart manufacturing, right? And so I went deep on this topic because one of the companies that came up was a company I know very well because I used to work for Apple and had interface with a lot of the major Apple suppliers. And one of the big suppliers uh, for Apple is a company called Lens. Lens is run by a woman named Zhou Chunfei, who's the richest woman in China. And she became that way because she developed the manufacturing supply chain for touchscreen glass. And so she was the person. Now, so I went back and looked at Lens and talked to a number of people there. I didn't get to talk to Zhou Chunfei about this, but this was a fascinating case, Aubrey, because she is just all in with AI, but it's not about the personal user friendly, individual user friendly aspect of it. Is how do I use AI? How do I use DeepSeek to make Lens smarter manufacturing? Right. And so she trains many of her vocational technical labor force on the use of AI now. And it's a huge focus. And so it was just an interesting learning for me because I was suddenly like, I was glad that my colleague pushed me into giving this talk because it was a great learning where here again, if I'm just a professor who puts my head in the sand, I'm not teaching my students how to think and use these issues. But if I'm a China scholar who puts my head in the sand, I'm not really thinking deeply about what the comparative issues are here. And in my opinion, even though the reputation of the US and AI is that we're the leaders in the field, I'm not so sure. It depends which field you mean. In smart manufacturing, China is doing way more sophisticated work than the United States is right now in the use of AI. And that was a big, big, big mind blowing moment for me because I was like, oh, okay, so there's something really important to watch here, and maybe something really important for the United States if we could be humble enough to learn. And
Hmm.
that's a really important moment for us. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. And it just as you were talking and just thinking about, just my own personal like weighing the differences, I feel that there's a lot of folks that I know, that we're using AI, ChatGPT to like sort of delegate our humanity, and our knowledge to those programs. And w- maybe it's a different way of thinking of using AI, how China's using it, where we're delegating the efficiency and the optimization so that we have more time to be human, and I think it is that balance. I think there's a lot of really interesting ways to use AI, but using it to pass our classes, to have our to be our knowledge base, I think that, yeah, that is a challenge. And so I can see where you started out with, really not being pleased with it because you're seeing your students kind of allow their brains to live there rather than bringing things into their knowledge. So, yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Um, so
Can
let's
I
see.
just add one other thing that? Sorry. I know you want to move on to the next question, but
No, no, no,
one
it's
other
okay.
thing that's really interesting is, again, I didn't know much about this before, but in addition to the use of AI, because China is much more of a state-led manufacturing infrastructure builder, China is doing, one of the big issues about AI right now is the concerns over the use of energy and how much energy and how much pollution is going to come out of the use of energy in building these data centers. It's a very, very energy intensive industry. China is so far ahead of the United States in renewable energy space. I mean, China is the number one producer in the world of solar panels, and it builds all of its factories with the use of solar panels for using renewable energy, and so China has this. I know it's very upsetting to a lot of Chinese officials because China has this reputation of polluting the world and, manufacturing that's just, but it's just wrong. Like China is actually very aggressive in the sustainable energy space. And this came up a lot in the interviews that I did for the AI of like, and you should see what we're doing with our data centers because we are being very, very careful with how much energy they are going to consume. And we're doing it as much as we can with renewable energy. And I was like, that's really interesting. Okay. Okay. Anyway, sorry for the tangent.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think that, there's a data center. I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan currently, and there's a data center going in down south of Ann Arbor. And that's a big part of the concerns of, the citizens in the area is, you know, is our energy company going to be able to provide enough energy for this data center? Is that going to pass on, expenses to citizens? And how are the citizens going to be subsidizing this whole thing? So I think, yeah, I think the renewable energy play is really important because it's an acknowledgement that this is a very energy intensive industry and it needs to, have a bigger picture when making those plans. So I think that's it's definitely something that we can learn from. So as we were reviewing our year, I know another important event that happened recently, in addition to that, the AI talk you gave in Arizona, I think is this conversation you had with the 300 CFOs in China as part of your keynote speech in Shenzhen. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, sort of where those seeds got planted and what that conversation was like and what you were hearing on the ground in Shenzhen.
Beautiful. Thank you, Aubrey. Let me just jump into that because yeah, it was as we were writing down the successes of 2025, but also just thinking about how 2025 ended. You're right. Like, there was the AI talk, but then there was this other talk that I was invited to, which was a little bit of a surprise for me because, again, I don't think of myself as an AI person. And, I do study Chinese economics, but the field of accounting and finance are very, very specific fields in both the business school world, but also in the corporate world. But I was invited by an organization called the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, which is a London-based organization that goes back to, I think they were founded in like 1908 or something, like a long time ago. And there are multiple ways that accountants and CFOs can be certified accountants for organizations, but they're one of the big ones. They're a big, big player. They're still based in London, but they have offices all over the world, including going back to the 1980s. They opened a non-governmental organization in China. And so they have offices in Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen. And, basically their role in the world is to kind of help certify CFOs and accountants in the accountancy field. And so again, like, I wouldn't normally think of myself as giving a keynote speech at an event like that because, as much as I study economics, I'm not an accountant. But once I got into a conversation with them, they reached out to me and they said, we're having a big event in Shenzhen. I think it was December 15th. And we'd like you to come give the keynote speech for it. We're fine on the certifying accountants. What we want is for you to come talk about your work on Chinese companies going global, because I have written a lot about, both foreign companies investing in China. And so as you noted, I talked a little bit about my work with Apple and sort of helping them navigate China, but I've had a lot of consulting projects where I've helped foreign companies try to navigate China. But more recently, the big issue has been for Chinese companies is that, China is now the second largest economy in the world. And it's, in my opinion and the OGL team's opinion, I know this is a little bit of a controversial thing to say. We firmly believe that China will be the largest economy in the world, probably in about 6 years. It is going to surpass the United States, and it is going to continue to grow and be powerful as a global economy. And so one of the big issues there is, how does China transition from just being the manufacturer for the world, where, it has a very powerful manufacturing supply chain, the most sophisticated smart manufacturing supply chain in the world, but also a deep labor pool of about 300 million people called the floating population that move around and work. In fact, it's a tremendous manufacturing system. That being said, you can't really claim your position as being the most powerful economy in the world, even if you're the largest economy in the world, unless your companies are influencing nations around the world, right? And so the Belt and Road Initiative, which was first launched in 2008, but sort of sat fallow for a while, but then relaunched by Xi Jinping in 2013. This is an initiative in which China is very much thinking about, how do we go out into the world and build along this notion of the Belt and Road. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a really fascinating concept historically, because the Belt is sort of following a line that goes through the South China Sea, through the Indian Ocean, over into Africa, and then up through the Middle East. What is the road? The road is Marco Polo's road, right? So if you go back a long time and sort of think about like how China developed such powerful technology, it was building that technology thousands of years ago and then exporting that technology to Europe over Marco Polo's road. And so this is like, the current administration thinking about like, how do we reinvigorate or help the world remember? Like, we often think of Gutenberg as the inventor that invented the printing press. Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press. China invented the printing press and paper, and then exported it to Europe, and Europe got credit for it. China also invented a little thing called gunpowder, right? China also had a much bigger armada and had the most sophisticated shit, so China's sort of reimagining itself in this. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a very powerful thing. But in order for China to reclaim that position as one of the most powerful, maybe the largest economy, but also one of the most powerful economies in the world, Chinese companies have to go global. They have to be thinking about their position in the world, and not just their position in Africa, but also their position in places like Germany and the rest of Europe and the United States. So so anyway, it was exciting for me to, this is more than the AI stuff. This is my area. Like, this is what I do work on, and it's what I've done work on historically, and I love this. And so I went to Shenzhen and gave a talk to a audience of 300 pretty high powered Chinese CFOs about the Chinese term is chuhai, which means to go out into the ocean, right? How do you go global? And so, that's what the talk was about. And, I sort of gave them my main issues that they need to think about. And I think one of the big issues that I like to emphasize, I love, a couple of key things that I always talk about that are historically tied to China. I always like to talk about pragmatism. Deng Xiaoping is 1979 was famous for having said, and this is sort of a way of pushing back against the idea of communism versus capitalism. Deng Xiaoping was famous for having said, I don't care if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. Now, that sounds like just a random statement, but think about what that means. What he was essentially saying in 1979, with a lot of people looking at him as what he was going to do in the post Mao Zedong era, he was saying, I don't care about capitalism or communism. What I care about is getting food to our people, right? What I care about is growing the economy. So
Mm.
pragmatism. And then there's gradualism. Mo shi guo he. Deng Xiaoping was also famous for saying, feeling for stones to cross the river, right? Again, I don't care what's on the other side of that riverbank as long as there's wealth and prosperity. And so these were two of my messages to this group of CFOs. My third message to the group of CFOs, though, was you guys need to do a better job at educating the world about who you are. You're not doing well, right? And so look at a couple of examples. And these are companies that I've actually, in addition to Apple and helping Apple educate China about who it was, I've also done work with a little company called Huawei, which, when I was in Washington, D.C., when I was dean of the business school at George Washington University, Huawei was one of my big clients. And, we failed. Like, we blew it because eventually Huawei got kicked out of the United States and laws were passed that didn't allow any companies that were developing chip technology to do business with Huawei. Now, in my opinion, this was stupid because I think if you want to watch your competitors, being in partnership with them is much better than pushing them out into the desert and then forcing them to innovate on their own. So, and that's what Huawei's done. Huawei has sort of is as competitive in the chip technology space as anybody is now, and they're doing fine without the partnership, and we just don't know what they're doing. But Huawei didn't do a good job. They had a big lobbying team, but we didn't do a good job educating. Similarly, TikTok did not do a good job, and it was a disaster. I wrote one of the amicus Supreme Court briefs for the TikTok case, and we lost. We lost that case. And here again, like Chinese companies, if you're going to go global, you need to be better at building partnerships and educating the societies that you're on. Now, one case that has been a little more mixed, and it's maybe controversial to call it a Chinese case, but if you agree with the way China frames the world, TSMC is a Taiwanese company, but therefore it's also a Chinese company. And TSMC they're still struggling a little bit, but they're doing an amazing thing in going global because they have already committed to investing $160 billion in the state of Arizona in building 3 fab sites, which is completely changing the economics of Arizona. And so, in my messaging to these CFOs, it was really about, if you want to go global, you got to think very strategically, and you have to think about pragmatism, and you have to think about partnerships, but you also have to think about building those partnerships that show that you're committed to investing. You're not just committed to going to the American market because it's your largest consumer market right now. You're committed to going here to help us rebuild the manufacturing supply chain in America, which is what President Trump talks about all the time. And so anyway, it was a really fun talk, and it was, again, much more in my wheelhouse than the AI stuff, but it was really, really fun to be with that group, and it was an honor. It was amazing.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's a spectacular, group of people to have a conversation with, to learn from and have that dialogue with. And, meanwhile, their job is to, kind of count the beans. Um, and make sure the money is flowing in and out properly, and your message to them is, yes, but you need to be thinking strategically and building relationships, and how does that work? And in some ways I wonder if they're being asked to grow their understanding of what their roles are and their influence inside of their organizations. And I'm excited to hear, maybe what some of those conversations were like, back at home, after your inspiring keynote. What kind of questions did you get from that group, afterward? Was there anything that stands out to you from kind of the post conversation, or the post keynote conversations?
So let me answer that in two ways. The first issue was, people were very interested in this partnership question. Like, okay, so how do we do that? How do we how do we think about this issue? And how do we build those partnerships? How did TSMC do that? How did Apple do it? And so, given that I was lucky that I've had good uh, experiences with both Apple and the little bit that I've helped TSMC, and also have seen some of the more negative cases like TikTok and Huawei. Um, I was able to kind of field those questions and really, really focus on the partnership issue. One of the things that was interesting also that came out, Aubrey, was um, my handlers, and there was a risk management team that was a part of the group that was handling me. They were more aggressive than I've experienced in the past about, and this was a pretty high level talk. So I understood that, they needed to be careful. But I'm a very pro China, China friendly player, which is, I'm sure, why they invited me. Um, but uh, in China today, you can't use words like capitalism. You can't use words that, sort of imply, you know, going down the road of capitalism. And, I was a little confused at first when they were sort of challenging me they read my PowerPoints and, went through the deck there. And I was confused at one point. And I said, what's the problem? Like, I'm very pro China. And they were like, Professor Guthrie, we know you're pro China. That's why we invited you. And we're very interested in what you have to say and how you can help us. But you have written articles that have said that China is very good at capitalism. And we can't say that right now. And I was just like, okay, okay. So it was a really interesting sort of nuance to the conversation, where people are interested in learning, and they're interested in going global, and they're interested in strategic thinking, and they're very open-minded, but there are nuances to how you have to frame these issues. And so it was fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think when you say that, I guess maybe tell me a little bit more about that phrase, because you do like to say that that China is better at capitalism than the United States is. And um, who who do you want? That to me, that seems, like a dig at the U.S., rather than a label for the Chinese economy. So tell me a little bit more about that. I'm curious what you mean when you say that.
Well, you're right. It is primarily a dig at the US, but it's just that was given the signal that you've got to be careful when you use certain words, because capitalism is a loaded word and we don't use that word in China right now. But to your point, yes, it's a dig at the US because, you know, we frame, we're still the largest economy in the world, and we're still growing at about, 2 to 3% a year. And, you know, GDP is great, but we're also a suffering economy. And we think China has stolen all of our jobs. China didn't steal our jobs. In 1980, under Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman was, the high minded University of Chicago professor, and great thinker about neoclassical economic theory. When he and Reagan got into power, we invited our own companies to go global to find cheap labor, right? Like we undercut the infrastructure of the labor market. Now, in the United States, in the last 40 years, we've seen the most significant shift of wealth and income from the working and middle class to the top 5% of the US economy. That statistic is there. It's very clear. And so, yes, our economy looks great, but we've shifted from being a manufacturing economy that supports the working and middle class to an economy that supports the white collar high tech economy, like Silicon Valley, like labor, like the law, the field of law, like the field of accountancy, like the field of investment banking and finance. Yeah, these economies are all doing great in America, but people are suffering, right? And so this is, one of the key underlying principles. Now, when I talk about China being better at capitalism than the United States, it's not just about class warfare. It's also about the ways in which China has very, very carefully and strategically created a system in which you have the central government, and we often think of China as a centrally planned authoritarian system. And Beijing does set the tone, and they have 5-year plans, but that's not how China's economy works. What China has also done is they've created something that we call local governments as industrial firms. And I borrow that term from one of my favorite China scholars in the world, Andrew Walder, who wrote an article in 1995 called Local Governments as Industrial Firms. That's very early in China's economic reforms. But what he saw is really what was happening was that this wasn't Beijing controlling things centrally. This was Beijing creating a culture of innovation amongst its local city officials, right? So local city officials in China are primarily focused on and judged by their success in one area, which is economic development and innovation of their cities. And so you just have this tremendous process of investment in sophisticated but also innovative manufacturing supply chains, right? And so when we think of China having stolen all of the world's jobs because of a cheap labor force, that's not what's happened. What China has done for the last 40 years is they've built the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so, there's a reason that companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart cannot be somewhere else, because China has built. Now, if you want to call that just sophisticated manufacturing, that's fine. I often, again, tongue in cheek, as you point out, and it's really a jab at the United States, say that, yeah, communist China is better at capitalism than we are. Think about that, guys. Think about it. But, I know that people in the United States, and by the way, this didn't just get me in trouble in China in my Shenzhen trip. It has gotten me in trouble with the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department called me a couple of years ago and said, "Did you post an article saying communist China is better than capitalism we are?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they said, "You better take it down." And I was on the phone with this person. I said, "Okay, you get the irony here. Like, we're a democracy. I can say what I want, and I'm not taking it down." And so, it is. But again, I think that really kind of thinking deeply about what it means to build a strong capitalist manufacturing and high-end service sector economy is a powerful thing. There's one other thing that I want to just raise here. I love Andy Walder's work. I love Barry Naughton's work. But the other person whose work I love is Justin Lin. Justin Lin is a very, very powerful person. He's come out with a new theory called the New Structural Economics. He was trained as a PhD student at the University of Chicago in the era of Milton Friedman. He then went on to be the chief economist of the World Bank from about 2008 to 2012, first Chinese person ever to be the chief economist of the World Bank. And then he came back to China and is now a professor and dean at Beijing University. And he also advises the Chinese government. And so he thinks a lot about this mixture of how to put the balance on economic development, central planning in 5-year plans, but also giving a culture of entrepreneurship to local entrepreneurs or local
Mhm.
city officials. So thank you for that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's fascinating, looking at there are many different ways to live in the world and many different ways to craft an economy and spur development and innovation. And I think there are some similarities as I'm learning. I mean, I'm not an expert here at all, but as I'm watching and learning, there's many differences, and things that we can learn from each other. I was thinking about it, like, what is it that kind of prefers to be called? What is it, a socialist market economy? Is that
Yeah,
the
exactly.
phrase?
Yeah, yeah, and that to them is fine. Socialist market economy. There's nothing wrong with being called a market economy. It's just the word capitalism is a very loaded word in
Mhm.
China today, and so you can't use capitalism, but you can say things like market economics and
Yeah. Okay.
economic structure.
Right, and that's important, and, knowing your audience is is key. So, Doug, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I know you and I, we check in frequently as friends and colleagues, and so it's fun to, try our hand at this conversation, having this conversation, for an audience. And we do aim, for our audience to have something new for you to watch and listen to weekly coming up as we as this conversation and continue our work and wanting to share it with you. So you know we do post a lot of deep thoughts, a lot of content on the ongloballeadership.com website. And Doug, in closing, why don't we share a little bit about the types of things you're thinking about and things that our viewers and our readers can look forward to in the coming weeks?
Sure. Thank you, Aubrey. And this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I so enjoy our partnership, but also just diving into the podcast and presenting these ideas to the rest of the world and to the rest of America. You very humbly said you're not a China expert, but I do think of you as a expert in many ways that have helped shape my thinking about a lot of things. In having these conversations, I like having conversations with really smart, insightful people who are not China experts because you can ask the kinds of questions that people around America might be asking, right? And so that's really what we want is a dialogue where we're talking about and tapping into what people are wondering about. And so I love this conversation and thought it was great, and I'm thankful for it.
Thanks,
To
Doug.
your point about we want to have a weekly cadence of our podcast. And we have a couple of different approaches to how we do our work, right? So we go deep in research. And so two topics that we've really been deep in the last couple of months. One is on the issue of rare earths. And, China is one of the leaders in the world in the production and refinement of rare earths. And so this is part of the smart manufacturing system that has been developed in the last 45 years. And so we've written a lot about that in recent months. And so I think we should talk about that. And there's another topic that's really interesting that's very hot in sort of the analyses of the Chinese economy, which is consumption. A lot of people make the prediction that the Chinese economy is going to go down because consumption isn't, building into the harmonious cycle that Adam Smith predicted hundreds of years ago. And there are reasons for that. We were asked by Justin Lin to do some writing on consumption, to kind of help uncover what the world is missing about China's consumption. So we wrote a 7-series article on Chinese consumption and kind of went deep, um, in terms of thinking about these issues, and have given those to the Chinese government, but also want them to be out in the world where people can understand a more nuanced approach for how the consumption issue is being unpacked in China. And we think the economic analysis of it right now is pretty shallow. And so we can talk about those two substantive issues. And then there are deeper issues as well that are related to just our analysis of the Chinese economy. And we'll continue to roll those out in the weeks to come as well. We also have something that we call OGL Real Time, which is these are usually shorter articles that are directly in response to important things that are happening in China, in US China relations, in China and global economy relations. And they're just things that pop up, and our China team rolls up our sleeves and gets deep on them very quickly. And so expect those to be coming out in the coming weeks as well. And with that, I'll just say thank you, Aubrey. This was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you, Doug. This was fun. And we'll see everybody next week.